Great. So hi, everyone. Good morning. Well, it's morning here. Good afternoon to most of you. I wish we were actually at the Aegean. I was actually at the Aegean, which I'm not. Shores and but this is the next best thing, I guess. And so I'm going to talk about social evolution theory in this segment of this summer school or seminars, and this is going to be probably somewhat different than the rest of the topics. It's going to be mostly sort of on theory and sort of how to build social evolution model and like the basic theoretical frameworks to use that are used in social evolution theory, including the price equation, Hamilton's rule, inclusive fitness, and sort of multi-level selection and evolutionary game theory, and time permitting, basically. So we'll see how far we get along. But I thought I would start with sort of a very general introduction to what social evolution theory seeks to explain. Why do we have social evolution theory in the first place? And the basic reason, and I hope you can see my slides here. I'm going to start with some slides, but most of the lecture is going to be actually sort of Blackboard. So the basic reason for having a social evolution theory is that basically all life is social. Everything lives with something else, and why the reason a lot of traits evolved and a lot of organisms' traits and life history and what affects their fitness is due to their interactions with other organisms. Okay, and so social means that things interact with each other. Okay, so here are some examples of sociality. These are birds called superb fairy wrens that are cooperative breeders in Australia, and in these bird species, so most bird species are monogamous, socially monogamous, and have biparental care. These guys, which is itself an instance of social behavior and cooperation, but these guys take it a step further, where offspring from previous years actually stay in the territory and help their parents raise more offspring. Okay, and that's called cooperative breeding. So this is, and in fact, this is sort of like what humans do too, where siblings might help their parents to raise younger siblings. And on the right-hand side, you have the European paper wasps, Polistes wasps. They are sometimes called primitively eusocial, and in this species, multiple females come together to found a nest. This sort of paper made out of this paper structure, and but once the nest is founded, then and during the founding of the nest, they establish a dominance hierarchy, and the dominant gets to do most of the breeding. And sometimes the dominant dies, and one of the other ones becomes dominant, and so on. But there's a lot of complicated social dynamics there. Okay, so these are both examples of group living. So these individuals are not individuals in these species don't not just have to sort of live in a group, but also function as a group to some degree, and function and help or sort of interact with each other to gain fitness benefits. Okay, this type of thing is not at all restricted to animals, let alone vertebrates. A lot of microbes also interact socially with each other. Almost all microbes. So particular sort of cases of that is particular instances of that actually have been very well studied, like biofilm formation in a lot of microbes, as in this case, this is a Staphylococcus aureus, which causes staph infections. And one reason that staph infections happen, or one of the mechanisms of staph infections, is that they are able to form biofilms on different materials, on tissues and different materials, for example, catheters, that allow cells to stick to it and then proliferate. And this biofilm formation is, if you think about it, is sort of a public good, okay, in the sense that a road is a public good in human societies, because once the sort of substrate for the biofilm is produced, a lot of different cells can stick to it, basically, but producing that biofilm is potentially costly, okay, and one of the advantages of biofilm formation is that it makes the penetrance of antibiotics harder. So therefore, it actually confers some tolerance or resistance to antibiotics. And of course, public goods derive a lot of human behavior and a lot of human social dynamics. Like I said, like roads or bridges and so on. There's a lot of examples of public goods at the grand scale, but you don't actually need a government to build a road or bridges or public goods in general. In fact, governments exist because of public goods, not the other way around. So here's an example of a public good without a sort of a formal government, at least, although they certainly had governance schemes probably. This is this is this is from the North America. This is the Blackfeet tribal lands in Montana, I believe, and Native Americans. So the ancestors of the Blackfeet Native Americans have built these what's called drive lines, which you can see in black here, and the scale here is, this is 1 kilometer. So these are drive lines. These are basically sort of low stone walls that extend for kilometers, and what they do is they have this funnel shape, as you can see. So there's one drive line here and then one drive line here, and what they do is that it turns out bison don't like to cross stone walls, even if the stone wall is not that not that big or not that strong. If they encounter a stone wall, they just turn and like go along it. And so once you figure that out, then you can build these big structures, and then you can take a herd of bison here, for example, and then you can basically scare them, and you can start driving them, and into this funnel. And this is a topographical map, and as you can see, these lines are very close to each other, indicating a very steep ridge, which is shown here. So basically, what they were doing is, after the production of this public good, they actually collectively drove the bison onto this ridge, where the bison had no choice but to fall down, basically, because they're getting pushed by other bison. And then at the bottom of the ridge, you would have a lot of fallen bison that were killed, and then you can butcher them at your ease and get a lot of meat for the whole for the whole village, for the whole tribe. So this is an instance of very large-scale cooperation that obviously humans are very well adapted to. Okay, and but this type of cooperative interactions exists not just within species, but also between species. Okay, so here are two examples. This is swollen. This is a acacia tree called swollen thorn acacias. They have these swollen thorns where they get their name from, and these thorns actually serve as housing for a variety of ant species. In this case, a Pseudomyrmex species. And what these ants do in exchange for this housing is, and also in exchange for food, in a lot of these cases, is they go out and protect the plant against herbivores like caterpillars and sometimes even mega herbivores, because they can annoy a lot of mega herbivores like deer and or a lot of the like giraffes. They can annoy them by just nibbling at their mouths while they're trying to eat the plant. So and there's lots of examples of these trees in both the neotropics and the in the old tropics. So here's and this is basically an example of the tree exchanging housing, which it builds with carbon photosynthate, and also food for protection. Okay. Another example of plants trading carbon for something else is these guys. These are these are rhizobium nodules on a soybean plant, and these are essentially these nodules, these little growths, harbor bacteria, soil bacteria called rhizobium, as a general group of bacteria, and rhizobium infect the plant roots and actually sort of lead to the formation of these nodules. And then inside these nodules, they actually inhabit plant cells. They actually go into plant cells, kind of like organelles. And within those cells, they fix nitrogen. And nitrogen fixation is frequently limited in terrestrial ecosystems, limiting in terrestrial ecosystems. So a lot of plants are nitrogen limited, but not legumes, the legume family. Most of the legume family because most of the legume family forms a symbiosis with rhizobia, where they get nitrogen in exchange for carbon. Okay, so this is another example of a trading relationship. Okay, so the point of all of this is all of these interactions are social interactions. How well an individual does, individual bird, wasp, human, legume plant or whatever, depends on its interactions, how interaction with other things go. Okay. And a lot of these interactions are cooperative, okay, in the sense that there's a benefit being provided by one party to the other, and a lot of them are actually mutually cooperative. There's a benefit provided by both parties to the other, so that both parties are better off. So then this creates a conundrum. So if the sort of textbook cartoonish version of evolutionary theory says, everything should be survival of the fittest. It's a competition for survival and reproduction and so on. So how can cooperative traits where you don't compete but you help others can evolve? Okay, and that's been a question for going back to Darwin. Actually, that's been a question for many decades. Okay. And here's sort of a mathematical, so it's quasi-mathematical, and we're going to get to the actual mathematical one, formulation of the problem. So this is sort of the classical evolutionary problem, like the simplest type of evolutionary model, where you have a haploid population. You have sort of basically individuals like bacteria, individuals who carry only a single copy of an allele, and one type, which we're going to call type A, so one allele, say, always leaves 1 plus S number of offspring, compared to an allele B, which always leaves one offspring. Okay, so this is sort of a classic example of selection. So if S is positive, then obviously the carriers of allele A or type A are going to leave more offspring, and and you can confirm that if you start with a low number of A, low frequency of A, over time, A will increase in frequency and eventually will fix in the population. Okay, that's kind of trivial, right? And it makes sense because A is fitter, right? So this is the easy problem. Whenever S is positive, then A will increase. Okay, but all these questions, all these interactions that I talked about before, they're not as easy, because in those cases, what happens to what is A's fitness or B's fitness doesn't just depend on their own type, okay, but it also depends on the other type, okay. So if there's social interactions, okay, within species or within species or between species, in this case, it's going to be within species. If there's social interactions, then the fitness of an individual depends not just its own type, A or B, but it also depends on who they're interacting with, okay, and what the type of the person or individual they're interacting with, okay. So you can, for example, have this, and in that case, you can't just have like two numbers, 1 plus S and 1. You need to have 4 numbers, or if you're willing to sort of normalize things, at least 3 numbers, okay. So, and you can arrange them in a matrix like this. So this is sometimes called a payoff matrix or a game matrix. Okay, and basically the numbers here are fitness values, assumed to be fitness values in this case, of a focal type, which could be A or B. So that's what I call the self genotype, and a part as a function of the focal type and their partner's genotype. Okay, so now a B individual could interact with an A individual or a B individual. An A individual could interact with an A individual and B individual, and they have different fitness outcomes depending on who they interact with. So, and in particular, in this case, I obviously I made up these numbers right now, right? I don't have a model to tell you. I do have a story to tell you about it, but I made up these numbers. So the story that goes with these numbers is that B's against B's, that's like the baseline. So you can take this as basically no interaction. So B's just don't interact much, don't do much socially, okay? So then they get some baseline fitness of 1, okay? And then, but A's in the story, when they interact, whoever they interact with, A's give out the benefit to them. A's are sort of cooperative. They are nice. They give candy to whoever they meet. Okay, so if you're interacting with an A type, if your partner is an A type instead of a B type, you get a benefit B. Okay, so that's why and in this case, I assume that benefit is you get that benefit regardless of what your own type is. Okay, so both A's and B's get a benefit B from their partner. Okay, so it's 1 plus B here instead of 1. Okay, but then giving out candy to people is costly. Okay, giving out sort of benefits to people, to individuals that you interact with, is going to have some cost. Okay, so this could be, for example, if the benefit is providing food, then you have to go and find the food yourself. Okay, so there's going to be some cost to providing benefits. Otherwise, everybody would provide benefits. Okay. So let's assume there's some cost C. Okay, so B and C are both positive numbers in this scenario. Okay, so there's some cost C. Okay, that if your own type is A, that you pay. Okay, remember, A's give out the benefit, but that benefit is costly to them. So that it benefits someone else, but it's costly to them. Okay, and B's don't provide any benefit or pay any cost. Okay, so in this case, so if B's and B's are interacting, they get 1. If B interacts with an A, they get 1 plus B, but they don't pay a cost C because they're not giving out any benefit. Okay. Conversely, if A interacts with B, they don't get a benefit from B because B's don't give benefits. Okay, but they do pay the cost of helping B, helping their partner. Okay, so they do pay this minus C cost. And then finally, if A's interact with A's, they both get the benefit from their partner because their partner is A, and they pay a cost C. Okay, so in this scenario, if B is greater than C, if the benefit that you give to your partner is greater than the cost that you incur, okay, then a population of all A's will have higher fitness because it's 1 plus B minus C, and if B minus C is positive, that's greater than 1. Okay, then a population of all B's. Okay, so in a sort of naive fitness maximization sense, you might expect these A's to be more fit, the population of the A genotype to be more fit, and therefore increase in frequency, because when they interact with each other, they actually get more benefit. But in fact, what happens is the exact opposite. So if partners are selected at random, if who you interact with is completely random in a population, okay, so meaning that it doesn't depend on your own type at all. So A's and B's interact with A's and B's with the same frequency, okay, regardless of their own type. Then even if you start out the population with all A's, eventually they will go extinct. Okay, and in this case, in this simulation, B is 0.3 and C is 0.1. Okay, so B minus C is greater than 0. So A is greater than B. So A's fitness when interacting with A's is greater than B's fitness when interacting with B's. So that implies that the mean fitness of the population actually goes down here. Okay, which is the opposite of sort of the basic, very simplest case in in the haploid population genetics like this, where if S is positive, A will increase. If F is negative, A will decrease. Either case, the mean fitness of the population goes up. Okay. Here, the mean fitness of the population is actually going down. Okay. So that's sort of the dilemma. That's the harder problem. Okay, when individuals interact. Okay, so and obviously, so this condition, this result is contingent on this statement. If partners are selected at random. Okay, if partners are not selected at random, if the probability of A's interacting with A's and B's interacting with B's are not the same, then all of this goes out. Okay, and this is what Bill Hamilton showed. Okay, so this is a passage from a classic paper, slightly less known, but a classic paper, and it's a delightful, like, 2-page paper in the American Naturalist in 1963, called The Evolution of Altruistic Behavior. Altruistic behavior is a kind of behavior we just discussed. Okay, according to Hamilton. And he lays out this problem that we just saw. He basically said it is accepted that behavior characteristic of a species is just as much product of evolution as the morphology, which we would not dispute at all at this point. Yet the kinds of behavior which can be adequately explained by the classical mathematical theory of natural selection, which is that 1/1 plus S stuff that we saw, is limited, right? Because, he says, this 1 plus S stuff, this basic population genetics theory, cannot account for a case where an animal behaves in such a way as to promote advantages of other members of the species, not its direct descendants, at the expense of its own. So it cannot account for the increase of a behavior that provides a benefit B to someone else at the cost of C to themselves. Okay. And then in this paper, I really encourage you to go and read this paper, because this paper is basically just a verbal description of how this is going to work. And then there's a single equation here, which is K, and K here is B over C. So the ratio of B to C is greater than 1/R. So this, Hamilton says that, just asserts in this paper, he just asserts that if B over C, the benefit to cost ratio, is greater than 1/R, which it says is the relatedness coefficient, okay, then such behaviors can evolve, and otherwise they won't evolve. Okay, and that's the paper. Okay, so how does that work? So let's go back to this sort of story that we had before. Instead of A's and B's, I'm going to change them actually to C's and D's. I'm going to just like shift the letters by 2, because I'm going to call these cooperators and defectors. Okay, which is sort of the more evolutionary game theory language. And I'm going to just put numbers here. Okay, so here, so defectors interacting with defectors is now they're both getting 2. So now there are 2 numbers actually, because in each interaction, both types get some payoff, right? In this case, it's symmetric, so I could only use one set of numbers and then just tell you to flip, but I decided to write both numbers. So the first number is the fitness or the payoff to this type, the row player, the player that selects the rows, and the second number goes to the player that's given by the column. Okay, so this is the payoff to this guy, this is the payoff to this guy, this is the payoff to this guy, and so on. Okay, so here, if you go from so defectors, okay, get a payoff of 2, which is our baseline payoff. Okay, so that's everything is relative to that defector payoff. Okay, so they both get 2. If they partner as cooperator, the defector gets 6 instead of 2, which means that the benefit they get from the cooperator is 4. Okay, but the cooperator will get 1 instead of 2, so which means the cost is 1. Okay, and in this case, and then the cooperators interacting with cooperators, they both get the benefit plus, so 2 plus 4, which is 6, but they also pay the cost minus 1, which is 5. Okay, so this is essentially this is the same game this is the same type of interaction as before. The only difference is that now the baseline fitness is 2 instead of 1, and I just put numbers to B and C. B is 4 and C is 1 in this case. Okay, so but suppose now these interactions are not random, and in this case, and so in the previous case, we show that if the interactions are random, things won't evolve, so cooperations will not increase. Okay, if these interactions are not random, you might have a case like this. So this is again a case that I made up. So these houses, these are two houses, they represent sort of subpopulations. Okay, and you have one house that's mostly cooperators with one defector, and you have another house that's mostly defector with one cooperator. And suppose you only interact with individuals in your house, okay, in your subpopulation. So then if you're a cooperator, there are so the cooperators in this population, right, tend to live with other cooperators, and defectors tend to live with other defectors. Okay, so if you're a cooperator and you're interacting with someone at random from your house, right, with probability 2/3 in this house, you're going to interact with the cooperator, and with probability 1, you're going to interact with defector if you're in this house. But most cooperators live here, right? Therefore, most cooperators will interact with other cooperators. And likewise, most defectors will interact with other defectors, okay? So that means that most cooperators are experiencing this payoff, 5, whereas most defectors are experiencing this payoff, 2. And then if this sort of assortment, if this sort of difference in probability of interacting with your own type is great enough, then the fitness of cooperators, the expected fitness of cooperators is going to be higher, okay? And that's what Hamilton's rule says, basically. If this assortment of individuals is strong enough or high enough, you have high enough probability that cooperators interact with other cooperators and defectors interact with other defectors, then cooperation evolves, okay? And one way to make this assortment is to arrange individuals into subpopulations or subgroups or family interactions, okay? So interacting with your kins, okay? And those are all sort of valid ways to increase assortment, okay? So the basic message from Hamilton is, and the basic sort of message of social evolution theory, in fact, is who you interact with matters, okay? And in particular, Hamilton's approach, your relatives are a particularly important sort of class of interactions because one, they're likely to have the same genes, and also they're likely to behave the same way you do. Okay, so which they are because they have they have the same genes. Okay, to the extent that these behaviors are sort of genetically inherited. Okay, and therefore, if you have interactions with relatives or family structured populations, then you tend to interact with your own types, okay? And that can lead to evolution of cooperative behaviors or altruistic behaviors, okay? So, and this was sort of Hamilton's basic insight. But if you actually look at the history of this, I mean, the same idea actually can be found in Darwin even, in the Origin of Species. Certainly Fisher talked about this sort of verbally. Haldane talked about this. Sewell Wright talked about this. Williams has talked about this. They have a paper in 1957 that sort of works out like sort of a special model for the evolution of altruism. But we tend to attribute this idea to Hamilton because Hamilton kind of showed this in sort of fairly sort of explicit and general mathematical detail from population genetics in this paper in 1964. Okay, and in fact, one thing that Hamilton did, one of the contributions of that paper, the big contribution of that paper was to tie this sort of type of selection to that kind of 1 + S type of, simple case. Okay, sort of make it look like you can have a 1 + S type scenario for social evolution as well. And in particular, he defined this quantity inclusive fitness, which was R, the relatedness coefficient, times B, which is R times B minus C, okay? So, or that would be the inclusive fitness effect, but then inclusive fitness would be 1 plus that effect, okay? And said if that influence of fitness effect is positive, then the genotype will increase. If it's negative, then the genotype will decrease. Okay, and that sort of makes it very, very similar to that sort of easy case of population genetics, haploid population genetics, where there's a selection coefficient S, and if it's positive, then it increases. If it's negative, then it decreases. Okay, so that's how Hamilton sort of formalized the selection in social situations. Okay, and just as a sort of demonstration of how this works in Hamilton this is the equation. This is the single equation in the 1963 paper in AMNAT. And like I said, that paper is like essentially like one-page paper, like very short paper. But then he published a two pages of paper in 1964, the next year, that came out in Journal of Theoretical Biology, and that is full with equations like this. Okay, so when he published this paper, when he published the AMNAT paper, he already had all these results written down. This paper was actually being held up in review, and so there was a reviewer who turned out to be Maynard Smith, who wanted him to split into two and do a bunch of other stuff and so on. And Hamilton was a little bit frustrated, I think, and went ahead and published this, like basically the core of his argument in AMNAT in one page, and like without any of the mathematical details. So what we'll do today is, after this sort of introduction, is we're going to kind of deal with mostly this part. We're going to deal with the mathematics of this. Okay. But keep in mind, what matters is sort of why we do this mathematics and what it means for sort of social evolution and behavior. And since then, and again, sort of Hamilton's notation is a bit atrocious, and like a lot of people don't actually read this paper. Basically, this is like hugely well cited, thousands of citations, but I'm convinced that not everyone reads the paper. But it is actually worth reading, because there's lots of he actually does very clever stuff in the paper that is very easy to sometimes misunderstand. But he actually is very clear about what he's doing himself. Okay, so any questions before I move on to the next part of the lecture? All right. So then I'm going to switch.
So for none.
Yes. What was that, Efe?
I mean, I said there are no questions so far.
Oh, okay, good. Good. Okay, so turns out, so we're gonna do Hamilton's rule eventually, and we're gonna actually derive Hamilton's rule mathematically, but turns out I find it useful to actually become armed with a slightly different sort of mathematical tool before deriving Hamilton's rule, and that is called the price equation. Okay. So the price equation is named after George Price. So it's not price as in like economics, but and in fact, George Price is also a very interesting character. He made actually very important contributions to evolutionary theory. One of which was to come up with evolutionary game theory with Maynard Smith. So you can actually, there's a biography of George Price, with a very interesting guy, called The Price of Altruism, I think. And he didn't start out as a biologist. He started out as I think, theoretical chemist, but then went into biology fairly late in his life, and within 6 years made very important contributions. So the price equation is sort of a very general, and so one of these contributions was the price equation, and it's a very general description of evolutionary change. Okay, and in fact, it's so general that it has no content. Okay, because it simply describes how the mean trait of a population, okay, and the trait defined in any way you want, really, anything that you can measure about individuals, how the mean of that trait changes from one generation to the next, okay, in any kind of setting, basically. We're going to do slightly sort of special versions of price equation, but none of the assumptions that we're going to make, the special assumptions that we're going to make, are really necessary. So the price equation is simply, because essentially the price equation is just an identity, mathematical identity. It doesn't have any biological content, but it is nonetheless very useful for thinking about selection or thinking about sort of cause of evolutionary change, okay, or pathways of evolution change if you want. Okay, so so before we define the price equation, that we need to actually, before we derive the price equation, we need to sort of define a couple of concepts, which may, I mean, if you've taken any statistics, they will be familiar to you, but it's good to sort of get reminded. So suppose you have two variables, okay, two random variables, and by random variable I mean the variables that can take on sort of random values, and a lot of statistics basically assumes that everything that you measure are random variables, okay, because you don't know what their values are, right? So they're random variables, they're drawn from a distribution as far as you're concerned, okay? So and in this case, you can think of, you know, these two variables as two, for example, traits of individuals, like height and weight of individuals, okay? So X can be height and Y can be weight, okay? And for each individual, okay, suppose, or for each measurement, you have one X value and one Y value, okay, one height and one, let's say this is height and this is weight, okay, one Y value. And then you can plot them in a you know, scatter plot like this, okay? And you can describe a lot of things about these things, right? So you can basically define, you know, X bar, which is the mean of X. So it's simply 1 over N, or N, big N. So number of individuals in your sample, number of data points times, you know, the sum of Xi is X bar, the mean of X. Y bar is, so that's equal. Y bar is 1 over N, Yi, okay. So these are just sort of the means. And of course you can write down the variance of X, right? Which is which is the mean of the difference between the Xi and the mean X, okay? So that's just the definition of variance. You can have the variance of Y. Okay, and so on, right? These are all sort of usual statistical quantity statistics that we know how to calculate. Okay, so but if you have sort of two variables that you measure about the single entities or collection of entities, okay, then so these are sort of just like single you know, statistics, single variable statistics. But you can also look at statistics about the relationship between those two variables. Okay, and the basic relationship is called the covariance. Okay, which is denoted by co, right? And it's simply defined as the mean, okay, of the deviation of the ith measurement from the mean in X direction, okay, times the deviation in the Y direction. Okay, so it sounds like it's like the variance, right? But instead of taking the square of the deviation of the value, right, you take the deviation in one direction, X direction, okay, and then multiply that with the deviation in the Y direction, okay, and then take the average of that deviation. And the importance of this quantity is if if it's the case that like it is here, sort of, right, that and in this case actually, so this is sort of let's say this is X bar and this is Y bar, right? So so here both X bar and Y bar are positive. Here they're both negative, and you know, here X bar. So here, sorry, in this region, both xi minus x bar is positive, and yi minus y bar is positive, right? Because y is greater than yi is greater than y bar, and xi is greater than x bar, right? And in this region, they're both negative. Okay, so the product will be positive. And in these regions, one of them is positive and the other one is negative, right? So the product will be negative. So if those two variables tend to be sort of positively associated with each other, as in this case, then covariance will be positive because you'll have more of the dots will be in this sort of quadrant and these two quadrants, and then fewer of them will be in these quadrants where they contribute negative numbers. Okay, so the covariance basically is, just as the name suggests, is a measure of whether two variables covary positively together or not, or anti-covary. Okay, another way of actually sort of notation of writing this I'm going to use is I'm going to use this sort of expectation kind of notation, which, you know, in stochastic processes and, you know, random variable theory, the expectation is this is the expectation of a random variable. But what I really mean here is sort of the sample means. But it's sort of it's easier for me to write it this way. So these are basically, because I have given you these data points and you can calculate these data points from this sample, or actually, and in fact, sample is not actually quite correct. This is a population of points, okay? Because I don't actually care whether there's another population that this is a subsample from. In practice, they're always going to be sample, but in this instance, theoretically, they're the population, but they're the population means of X and Y, okay? And this is the population mean of the square and so on, okay? But I'm going to use this sort of expectation notation. So then the covariance of X and Y is you can write it as the expectation of X, and expectation of X and, oops, xi minus x and yi minus y, okay? Or the average, population average of this. Okay, so and just to remind, and then there's a bunch of useful relationships about the covariance. So for example, the covariance of X and Y is equal to the covariance of Y and X. So it doesn't matter which order you write it, because obviously, you know, you can just switch the order of this product and it's the same thing, okay? And the other thing is that you can multiply out this product, and what you get is xi times yi minus yi x bar minus x bar, or sort of y bar xi minus x bar y bar, okay? And of course, sort of taking the average of a sum is the same as the summing the averages of each of the elements of the sum, okay? So then you can basically distribute this average operator over each of the elements of the sum, okay? Which means that you get the expectation of the product here, and then minus the expectation of yi times x bar. But x bar itself is an expectation. So x bar is actually not a random variable anymore. It's just a fixed number, right? So you can take that out of the expectation. So then you're only left with expectation of yi, which is y bar. So you have x bar minus y bar, and then the same thing here for this term, for the y bar xi term, you get y bar x bar, and then the same thing for the last term, which has a positive sign in front of it, in fact, which is also x bar y bar. Okay, so then the whole thing is basically you can write it as the expectation of the average of the product of x and y minus the product, because you have two minuses and one plus, minus the product of the averages. Okay. So this is the average of the product. So you first take the product and take the average.
Erol hocam,
yes.
Can you check the chat?
Okay. Yes. And I should probably stop soon because it's 45, 46. Right. Yes, good. Yes, I corrected that before before checking the chat. Yes, thank you, Cheryl. Okay, that happens to me all the time. So feel free to point out if I say something wrong. Okay, so this is a very useful relationship, and it's going to be, or another way of writing it, of course, is using the E notation like this. Okay. Okay. Should I stop here and continue in the next lecture?
It's up to you.
Okay. Let's write down. Let's write down one more thing and then stop. Okay. So one thing. So this covariance is a very useful property. Okay, but it has one problem, which is that if you change the units of x and y, so if you, for example, do, you move to the United States and now height is now in feet and inches instead of centimeters, then all these numbers change. Okay, so you may still have a positive relationship between height and weight, right? But the actual value of the covariance will change. Okay, so because the numbers change, right? So a lot of times in biology and in statistics, and when we want to express the relationship between two variables, you want to have some sort of standardized way of expressing that relationship, so that if you move one standard unit, so for example, one standard deviation, you'll get the same change in the other variable. So if you move one standard deviation in height, for example, whether it's expressed in centimeters or inches, you get the same deviation in y. Okay, and that's that's usually done by scaling the covariance. Okay, so one way to do it is to scale the covariance by the variance of x. Okay, so and that's called the linear regression coefficient, and it's defined by, it's usually expressed as, it's usually denoted by beta, and beta of y and x is the regression of y on x, and as you'll see, the ordering of the regression coefficient, the ordering of the variables in the regression coefficient actually is consequential, because it determines what goes into the denominator. Okay, so the regression of y on x is simply the covariance of x and y divided by the variance of x, and this division basically just ensures that what the issue with the scale of x is taken care of. Okay, so so whatever unit you express scale in, now if you move one standard deviation, which is the square root of the variance, obviously, if you move one standard deviation in x, you'll get the same, and it has the same beta yx, you'll get the same deviation in beta, you get the same change in beta. Okay, and so these are all sort of definitions that we're gonna kind of use in a little bit. Okay, so let's take a break for 10 minutes, I guess, and then we'll continue with using deriving the price equation and using it to derive Hamilton's rule.
All right, so